Hey y'all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going to go over my round 2 game from the Washington Chess Congress. Now, if you followed the round 1 video, you know that I won a really tough game against an untitled player with black, and I was kind of happy to escape with the win and get on and maybe play a little bit better in this game with the white pieces. My opponent was actually someone that was familiar to me. I'd seen him around the tournament circuit, coming up as a junior player, and actually one of the few, black titled players you actually see at tournaments. International Master Oladapo do. Oladapo is, I believe, a full-time chess coach now. He actually sported some of his chessware from his company. I believe it's called Dipsay Chess. So I think he does some work near and around the Maryland, D.C. area with teaching chess kids. But yeah, very, very interesting personality, and someone that I don't believe I'd actually played against over the board, but had seen at tournaments for pretty much over a decade. So an interesting challenge. So I am higher rated than him at this point. I believe his FIDE was actually, even though he's an IM, I believe his FIDE at this point is a little bit below 2,300, but still a very, very tenacious player. And I think this rating is really more a reflection of his playing activity or lack thereof than anything else. So I was not taking this one lightly. So without further ado, let me get into it. So I'm with d4, and Oladapo played knight f6, and this was actually not a huge surprise to me. It's funny because I didn't really do a crazy preparation for this game. You seldom have that privilege playing in an open tournament in the U.S. because you get the pairings like 5 minutes before the round starts. So I just had to rely on what I'd already known about him, and I'd seen some games of his just from walking around tournament halls in the past, and had noticed that he was actually kind of a perk / King's Indian type of player. So basically, regardless of what white was going to trot out, he seemed to really enjoy the kingside fianchetto coupled with d6, and that type of archetype is actually basically suggests dynamic dark square play, yeah, that's kind of what I thought to expect. I think it's actually a good opening pairing. I talk about this sometimes when people ask me, well, what is the right opening to play? What should I play as against d4? What should I play against e4? And what I typically say is you should play openings where you have pawn structures that are fairly consistent. And so what I mean by that is there are certain openings that you could play against e4 and d4 where, regardless of how white plays, you kind of get similar structures. And I think the pawn structures you enjoy should guide your opening choices. And so clearly, Oladapo likes these dark squared openings, playing on the dark squares. And so I think his opening pairing of Perk and King's Indian actually fits really well. Another one that fits really well is actually the Slav and the Caro-Kann, for the simple fact that in both lines you play c6 and d5. You get your light squared bishop outside the pawn chain, and then just kind of proceed with your development. And I think, again, having those pairings actually makes your life a lot easier and helps you learn better, just because you get more familiarity with structures, and the pawns are the soul of chess, right? So anyways, after knight f6, I kind of expected a King's Indian, so the question was, how do I deal with that? And I decided to play knight f3, deferring the decision for another move. But now after g6, I really do have to make somewhat of a decision, because I can go fianchetto, or I can go for c4 and wait a little bit longer. But I decided to play the good old trusty London system with bishop f4. And if you've been following this series, you know that I've employed the London system quite a bit over the course of the past year, with varied success. I think maybe it's not varied success. I'm not so sure I've lost a game as white in the London system. If I have, please be sure to point that out to me, but I'm not sure I have. So maybe I should trot it out more. But the point is, with the London system, you're not necessarily getting an opening advantage per se. You're just getting your pieces out to reasonable squares and then proceeding from there. So that's kind of what I was intending to do with bishop f4. So anyways, after bishop f4, bishop g7 is played. I played the move e3. And typically in this structure, I don't actually consider giving myself an escape square on the diagonal until black has actually played d6. So I played e3, and now black played the move d6, and the threat if you will, is actually this knight h5 move, trying to secure the bishop pair. So if I do something like bishop e2, now there's knight h5, and if I go back to g3, black will just take. But if I go to g5, black will chase the bishop around the horn, as I like to say, and the bishop winds up getting back to g3 anyway. Now, there is something kind of interesting about this position, and that's actually you can try to challenge this knight to make it a little bit more difficult for them to get the bishop pair with the move knight d2. And the idea is that if black takes on h4 now, then after bishop takes h5, the argument is that these pawns are doubled and they're essential pawns around the black king that eventually does seem to castle kingside. And so this might not be the best circumstances under which to secure the bishop pair. But actually, just a little bit of a chess secret, if you will, this move knight f4 here is actually very, very annoying and kind of does well to combat the knight d2 to expose the knight on h5 plan. And the point is now that the g2 pawn is hanging and the bishop on e2 is hanging, and the bishop on h4 is hanging, black will get a bishop pair and along the way actually incur some damage to white's pawn structure. So pretty much if I take this bishop now, after g takes h4, these are now double pawns in the f file, but perhaps even more significantly, the d4 pawn is actually way more sensitive than it was a move ago. So essentially, even if I play c3 to reinforce this pawn structure and this chain that restricting the bishop on this diagonal, black can more easily undermine this structure with c5 now that the f4 pawn, the e3 pawn is now an f4 pawn, because on e3, the triangle of pawns would be unassailable against this bishop on the diagonal, whereas here, it's not necessarily the case. So basically, this knight h5 thing to chase the bishop around is actually quite a serious idea, and because of that, I actually played h3 now instead of going bishop e2. So very, very important to understand those kind of move order tricks. So anyways, after h3, black castled, and now I played bishop e2, and I'm pretty much trying to castle quickly, play c3, knight bd2, and get that kind of boilerplate setup you get in the London system. So black now played b6. This is actually quite common. Double fianchettoing and also getting more control of this e4 square. A lot of times for black, the control of the e4 square is kind of paramount to the success of black's defense, because white has a really good space here in the center and is controlling the d4 square. And e5 is something that is generally discouraged because white actually welcomes the opening of this diagonal. After a pawn tension with the bishop on this long diagonal, peering at these queenside and central pawns actually is quite uncomfortable for black. So typically, black will try to play c5 instead and keep this diagonal kind of shut down. So b6 helps prepare that push. So after b6, I castled. Bishop b7 is normal, getting to that e4 square. c3, also normal, reinforcing my pawn chain here. And after knight bd7, I went a4. A little bit of a difference in move order, keeping this knight on b1 for an extra second, because in some lines, the knight may consider going to a3 instead of to d2. But I really had the intent to probably put on d2 anyway. I just wanted to throw in this move first. And the idea with a4 is that I'm actually kind of threatening a5, trying to soften up the black queen side. So black typically plays a6 against this, and that's what Oladapo did. And now I went knight bd2, and we pretty much have the boilerplate London setup. White's not better at all, but doesn't really have any bad pieces, and then starts to kind of play in the center and on the queen side. So now black actually played knight e4, and this is actually a thematic move for black in this system. Typically, when you're lacking space, and black did lack a little bit of space in this system, in this setup, not having a pawn on the 5th rank yet, you want to actually trade some minor pieces because that alleviates the congestion in your position. And so knight e4 is a really good maneuver that does just that, and also keeps firm control of the e4 square. So typically here, white does wind up taking on e4. I did do that. And after bishop takes e4, this is kind of the question that a lot of London players have, myself included, which is after that pair of knights gets off the board, what is the best way to play from here? How should white try to press onward and get a little bit of something in this position that most people would perhaps consider to be a bit stale? And my thought process was, well, the bishop on e4 might be slightly misplaced, ever so slightly, because it's a little bit more vulnerable here than it is on b7. And so in the interim, maybe I could drum up a little bit of play on the queen side, in part connected to this a6 pawn, and also perhaps the weakness of this diagonal. So I decided to play the move bishop g3 first as prophylaxis, just to pop back from the e5 break coming with tempo. And then my plan was to go queen b3. And my concept was that if I connect the rooks and have this queen on this diagonal, it makes it difficult for white to try and play e5 or f5. And I also potentially eye some important light squares still on the queen side. So, yeah, bishop g3 was actually the first new move as far as I could tell from my database in this position. But the concept was to follow up with queen b3 and really just allow the bishop on e4 to stay there for just a moment, because I didn't see it was, doing anything super critical. So anyways, after bishop g3, black played rook e8. And this is an interesting choice because it pretty much telegraphs this e5 break, which I thought probably does not make a lot of sense given the fact that you do soften up this diagonal, and you're not even getting a tempo on my bishop by playing e5. So I thought it was a little bit strange to go for this. The other thing that I thought was kind of interesting about that move is it made f7 just a touch more sensitive than it was a move ago, and already queen b3 in conjunction with knight g5 I thought was quite dangerous. So here I start with the move queen b3, and already I have a threat in the position. If I could move again, knight g5 would be a winning move, because I'd be hitting the bishop on e4 and threatening this sensitive pawn on f7. And I thought here that, maybe white actually had, quite a serious advantage based upon that threat, because, again, this rook is just a little bit awkward on e8 to my eyes. But in this position, after queen b3, Oladapo played e6, and then I think I basically tempered my excitement a little bit, because e6 has the dual purpose of both stopping knight g5, but also blocking my queen along the a2 g8 diagonal. So in one fell swoop, it appears that at least my initial threats are kind of nullified. And then the question is what to do in this position, because essentially I do have my rooks connected, which is fantastic, but one of the things you want to look for after you connect your rooks is pawn breaks. And the tricky thing for white in the London system is a lot of times white is basically playing in a kind of cagey fashion and waiting on black to overextend with the pawn break, because in that way it would kind of activate white's pieces. So, for instance, the e5 pawn break is typically welcome because the bishop might have some influence. Now, the c5 pawn break is also welcome because of that d6 pawn being more sensitive, because the e pawn's no longer on e7. And any pawn break that white plays on the flip side actually kind of weakens the chain in the center. So if I play c4, as I actually did in a game against Murali Karthikeyan at the Extracon Open this year, the bishop, this dark red bishop on the diagonal, actually becomes a real force. And you can actually, if you've seen that game, be sure, if you haven't seen that game, be sure to check that one out, because white actually got a worse position extremely quickly. Essentially, after I played c4, black still had this pawn on e7 and played c5, and essentially my center was crumbling and this whole diagonal was really weak, and basically black's bishop turned out to be much better than its counterpart on g3. So yeah, that's the thing, is that you don't really want to play c4 because you weaken d4, and you don't really want to play a5 because then that typically allows b5, and then the a5 pawn might be a little bit sensitive. And then you also are a little bit unsure about playing e4 because the d4 pawn is also weak. So that's kind of the conundrum, is what to do without, having a pawn break. And I really wasn't sure, and so I went knight d2. And the idea with knight d2 is to challenge this bishop. Clearly, I wasn't not getting pressure on f7 anymore, so I thought it maybe would make sense to get rid of these light squared bishops, and then maybe I'd have some play against some of these light squares on the queen side that would be a little bit more sensitive with black's light square bishop being gone. So after knight d2, black played bishop b7, and here I played the move bishop f3, trying to trade these bishops. And this position is actually extremely similar to the one that I had against Marali Karthikeyan, because I went for the same plan with bishop f3, knight d2 and bishop f3. The difference here, though, is that black has played the move e6, which I think helps me a little bit, because now c5 isn't really in the cards because d6 is hanging, at least for the moment. And the other thing that's a little bit different is that my pawn is on c3 instead of c4, so my center is pretty much intact. So I thought I pretty much had a slightly better version of that game I had at the Extracon Open. Now, remarkably, because we're talking about what to do for white in this position, the computer actually suggests the move a5. And this is a move that I wasn't strongly considering, but it actually has some merit here based upon the fact that the queen is already on b3, kind of lined up against the bishop on b7. And after the move b5, which is the most natural choice, trying to keep the pawn structure intact, not get an isolated pawn on a6 after b takes a5, I can actually go c4 and take advantage of this bishop on b7 being unprotected, because now b takes c4 is not possible because I just pick up the bishop. So after c4, black would need to play e5 and actually get play in the center himself because of the nature of his pawn structure. Again, note you can't reinforce his pawn with c6 because the d6 pawn is actually hanging. And so tactically, it appears that I'd be winning a pawn for nothing, and so black actually has to, proceed with operations in the center to justify the pawn that he's potentially losing. The variation continues: d takes e5, bishop takes e5, and c takes b5, and after bishop takes g3, f takes g3, and queen e7, a messy position is on the board where white is a pawn up, but the pawn structure on the king side has actually been ruined a little bit to try and win that pawn. But in return, white actually has pretty decent pressure against the f7 pawn, and so white actually is a slightly better here, and the computer suggests the move bishop c4 here to actually further put pressure on f7 and to take advantage of the half-open f-file for white's rook. So very, very interesting variation and kind of a rare tactical opportunity in the system that I think I'll definitely need to study and examine a little bit more, because a lot of times when the bishop on b7, when the bishop is on e4 and is actually challenged by knight d2, a lot of times it actually does wind up retreating to b7, and so maybe this a5 and c4 idea is a thing that can happen more than just this game. So, yeah, something to think about. I went for the move bishop f3 just because it was something that was familiar with to me and a little bit more natural. And after queen c8, we actually have the same kind of construction that was employed in the game I played against Marali Karthikeyan, where instead of actually taking on f3 right away, you actually put the queen to b7, or essentially inviting the trade on b7, putting the queen to c8, because then the queen actually replaces the bishop as the kind of purveyor of the light squares on this diagonal. So very, very interesting concept, and you can see it's happening multiple games, so it's probably pretty legit. So here I decided to play rook e1 and keep that tension and not take right away on b7. Typically, that's a good thing, keeping tension in positions. And here, black took on f3 and kind of blinked first. And after knight takes f3, played queen b7, replacing the bishop on this diagonal, and also maintaining control of the e4 square. And I was basically thinking here that if I do nothing, black's next few moves will probably be knight f6 and knight e4, hitting my bishop on g3 and retaining control of the e4 square. And I really thought that I wouldn't have very much, if anything at all, in that position. So I decided to try and, clarify matters a little bit more, at least not give black that opportunity. So I went for the move e4. And e4 is a bit of a controversial move in some respects because it's not entirely consistent with the London system. You don't normally, rush to kind of soften up the d4 pawn, as I mentioned before. But I thought it was very justified here because not only am I controlling the e4 square and taking it away from the black queen, but c5 also is not possible, and that's the typical response in this setup to kind of attack that d4 pawn right away on account of the fact that the d6 pawn is actually hanging, and because the black pawn on the e file is on e6 instead of on e7 where it should be. So yeah, I thought this was kind of justified, although I didn't think it was giving white any advantage. I thought it was just something that, kept a little bit more tension in the position. And I do have what's, you typically would call a nice center. So nothing wrong with having a nice little space advantage, right? So anyways, after e4, black played e5, actually picking up the gauntlet and essentially challenging my control of the center. And this is actually a pretty interesting decision because I don't think it's entirely necessary. I do have this nice center, but I'm not so sure I want to rush to resolve things because, first of all, if I play e5, then black could play d5 and then prepare for the c5 break. And d5 I wasn't too sure about because black would be able to play knight c5 and actually hit my queen on c2. So I'm not too sure if I'd want to push either pawn in the middle anyway. And so I think e5 maybe is a little bit premature, but fully playable because I just don't think that it was necessary to kind of challenge my center right away until you were completely ready. Now, an argument could be made that black is ready because the e4 pawn is sufficiently under fire, so ed4 is actually a threat to which I could actually lose a pawn. So I do have to do something about it. But I did kind of welcome this because it does open up this diagonal for my bishop. So anyways, after e5, I played d takes e5. I could potentially defend the e4 pawn by making a modest move like queen c2, but I wasn't super enthusiastic about e4, c4, knight f6, and again, the e4 pawn is coming under more fire. The other thing I did think about briefly was a move like knight g5, essentially targeting the f7 pawn, and this actually seems kind of interesting, but I thought that with the move rook e7, black defends that pawn and then can kick my knight away on the next move, and I'm not so sure what I gained by playing knight g5. Maybe in some positions I would want to force h6, maybe that weakens black's kingside pawn formation a little bit, but I wasn't so sure it was worth it, so I instead decided to just take on e5. After d takes e5, knight takes e5 was played, and I actually expected this. If you play bishop takes e5, now I would play knight takes, and I actually think white would be slightly better in this position because the dark squares on the king side are weakened with the absence of the dark squared bishop. So I actually fully expected knight takes e5. The other reason d takes e5 is not so great because now this bishop is kind of shut out of play, and this e5 pawn could be a target for my pieces, and the open d file now might also present some problems, so I didn't think this was so great either. So I did expect knight takes e5, and here I was actually kind of looking at this position from afar and thinking that maybe I might have a little bit something here in an endgame based upon the fact that the bishop is somewhat restricted along this diagonal, and there are some light squared weaknesses because of b6 and d6. So I did think some light squares were very weak, c6, d5, c4 in particular. And so I actually made the very controversial decision to actually give up my bishop and play bishop takes e5. And it was based upon having some pressure on the light squares in an ending. So after bishop takes e5, black played bishop takes e5, and I didn't take on e5 with the knight here, but instead played the move queen d5. And this was basically my concept, was that maybe I could get a little bit of an edge or some pressure in an endgame based upon my light square control. And black actually obliged. Black played queen takes d5. You could also consider c6, but I think I'd be kind of happy with this because now after queen d3, the queen is not exerting pressure on e4, and c6 and d6 are a little bit loose, And there might be positions where I go knight takes e5 and rook a d1 and control the one open file in the position. And it's it would probably be a bad idea to contest with rook a d8 because I could get 2 rooks for the queen in a position where there's only one open file. I think white would actually be winning. So c6 was also an option, but probably ill-advised. And so queen takes d5 was played. And after e takes d5, we actually have this end game that I was actually looking at in my calculation. And basically the question is this enough? Is it a serious idea? Does white have the ability to press in this position? It's quite an interesting question and something really worth thinking about in depth. And I was actually quite happy to get this because I'm very at home in queenless middle games, and I wouldn't actually say this is an end game necessarily, but it's just a middle game without queens. Still many pieces on the board, but I'm not going to be checkmated anytime soon, and I can kind of loosen the screws slowly. And so this is the kind of position that I actually enjoy playing. So yeah, just very, very interesting concept. So after e takes d5, black pretty much, has various ways to play here. You can think about whether you want to keep the bishop on the board or not, which pawn breaks to play for. Black decided to play the move bishop f6. And I actually think this is an interesting and somewhat reasonable choice because for the moment, the bishop is actually restricting the knight's mobility in the center and on the king side. I would love, in a dream scenario, to get my knight to c6. But as long as the bishop is on that diagonal, I don't really have the privilege of doing it because a position after bishop takes d4 and c takes d4, I don't believe offers white anything. Even though I would have good pressure on the half-open c file, I just don't believe having those double pawns would give me anything. So I didn't want to do that. And then the other thing that's kind of annoying about this bishop is that even though my pawns are currently restricting the bishop on the diagonal, if I move them, all of a sudden the bishop becomes a force. So the issue is that I do want to kind of to press my microscopic advantage on the queen side. I would love to push these pawns a little bit, but I don't really want to give the bishop activity. So the question is actually how to improve. I decided to play the move king f1, and I actually thought this was a really clever choice because basically in a dream scenario, I would love to bring my king towards the queen side, but it's really difficult to do that with the rooks basically staring each other down in this position. Of course, if I play rook takes e8, black will capture, and then this rook will come to e2 and start to challenge the b2 pawn, and black would have sufficient activity here. And sure, I could play king f1 and stop the rook from infiltrating on e2, but I just think the rook having control of the e file prevents my king from getting active, and if my king doesn't get active, there's just no way I can entertain any pressure here. The other thing that I have to be a little bit careful about is in some positions, black playing for b5 and then b4, ultimately opening up the dark squared diagonal towards a1. So, I have to be very, very careful about how I make exchanges because I really do want to get my king towards the center, and I thought king f1 was a nice way to kind of wait on black. Now, black, on the other hand, again, would love to play b5, but has to be careful with doing that. If you go b5 right away, I could play rook takes e8, and after rook takes e8, take on b5, and then go rook a7. And all of a sudden, it's actually white that has decent pressure here because I'm the first to kind of attack these black pawns. And again, going passive is probably going to spell your death because then I have rook b7 and one of the pawns drops. And, once one pawn drops on the queen side, the rest will follow. The other thing, and the reason that, this position I did think was a little bit better for me on the queen side was because the move c6 is not something you can actually get away with because you pretty much weaken the whole structure. So even if you wind up getting the pawn back with rook c8 one day, or maybe you take first and then go rook c8, the point is that whites must be a little bit better here because having these split pawns will make it very difficult for white to defend the queen side. That was essentially what I was pinning my hopes on. So anyways, after king f1, black played the move king f8, and this is actually a good move. Essentially, keeping up with the game of chicken. We're both kind of staring each other down on the e-file. And, not allowing my king to kind of pass through. And it was in this position that I actually kind of realized that I was not better at all. Because if my king can't get to d3 or c4, I don't really have anything. And I thought that if I made any kind of waiting move, black now actually has that plan of going rook a, b8, and b5. And the big benefit here, compared to the position a move ago with rushing with b5, is that the king is actually protecting the e8 rook. So essentially, whenever I go rook takes e8, black will go king takes e8, bring the king to d7, and the queenside pawns will be intact. So let's just say I play a nothing move like g3. Well, now rook a, b8 is a serious idea, and b5 is actually a threat. And in many of those positions with b5, black will actually consider recapturing on b5 with the rook because it makes the b2 pawn very weak. So again, let's say I make a move like h4. Now after b5, if a takes b5, rook takes b5 is actually a serious move because you're attacking d5, you're also attacking b2. And if I lose the b2 pawn, this bishop actually is a menace on that diagonal. So all of a sudden, it's a black that's actually getting the counterplay and me not really getting my king over. And so for that reason, I played the move rook e2, which did two things. It basically kept the tension on the e-file, basically inviting black to take on e2, but it also indirectly defended, or not indirectly, directly defended the b2 pawn horizontally. So just also a little bit of prophylaxis against the eventual b5 if it actually came on the board. So yeah, interesting decision, and a kind of a weird move to play, but I thought very necessary. After rook e2, black actually played rook takes e2, and I thought this was a mistake because it kind of played right into my hands. Again, I was hoping that my king got towards the queen side, and now he's voluntarily helping me do that. Instead, I think the move rook a, b8 anyway is still quite effective because this b5 idea is quite a serious idea. To try and hold the fort here, I would need to play the very difficult to see knight e1, trying to actually bring the knight to d3 to defend the b2 pawn. And after rook e5, I think black is just getting good counterplay now. I would need to take on e5 because, again, c4 opens up the bishop on this diagonal, so I'd have to take on e5. And after d takes e5, now all of a sudden the d5 pawn is actually quite loose. And so I could go knight c2 trying to defend it on b4, e3. But now a5 takes away the b4 square from my knight. And then after knight a3, trying to get to a new outpost, black can play rook d8 and challenge the d5 pawn. And I could play rook d1, but after bishop e7, knight c4, and f6, black actually is kind of consolidating here. And while it does seem still a little bit more pleasant to play white's position because of the light square control, I think this is a difficult line for both of us to see. And frankly, I think some of black's moves were a little bit easier to play than white's. So very, very interesting position. Also gives you a sense of what I was angling for in all these setups, because you can see here, even here I have the light square control that I'm looking for, which makes it difficult for black to kind of deal with his own queenside pawns, but a position that's defensible and playable for both sides. So anyways, instead we had this rook takes e2, and now after king takes e2, I got kind of excited because my king is coming to d3. Once the king's on d3, there won't be any entry squares for the black rook on the e-file, and I thought, maybe I can get something here. So after king takes e2, black played king e7. I went king d3, and then king d7 was played. And now I have to come up with another plan because I have my king on the square I want it on. But how do I kind of improve my position and play with these the light squares was the question, because, again, I didn't think these knight transfers would bear too much dividends. And here I could recapture with the king if bishop takes d4, but I thought that now after rook e8, I still have to worry about rook e2, and if I go king d3, then there's rook e5, and I think there's enough counterplay here for black to hold quite easily. So I didn't want to give up the knight for the bishop, and I need to try and improve, and this was actually the critical position of the game because There are a few different ways you could try, but there's really only one way that's effective. So why don't you pause the video for a moment and try to see how you would proceed here with white. All right, hopefully you got a chance to pause the video and try and figure out a path forward. The way that I tried to proceed forward was not actually correct. I played the move Rook A2, and Rook A2 is a little bit too smart for its own good. I'll get into why I did that in a moment, but actually the best move in the position and the most challenging way to play is actually Rook E1. And the idea is that if black plays passively with a move like Rook B8, trying to prepare this B5 break that we constantly were talking about was an idea, I can actually go Rook E4. And the idea is that this actually kind of is great prophylaxis against B5, because after B5 I have to move Rook B4. And remarkably, this pin on the B file actually ensures that I still fix the B pawn as a weakness and a potential target. So after like H5, I can actually go Knight E1 and improve my pieces a little bit and get that knight to A3. And after Bishop E5, Knight C2, C6, D takes E6, King takes E6, and Rook B3, I've actually kind of elicited a weakness that I was trying to elicit, which is these pawns are now split. So, black has one extra pawn island. And the knight now is coming to B4, where it could potentially start to tickle black's position a little bit. And so after Rook A8, now I actually have the move Rook A3. And again, I'm actually threatening A takes B5, and you can't recapture with the A pawn because the rook is hanging. And so, all of a sudden, white actually kind of gets somewhere with this nice maneuver and then creating some pins against the black rook. And this would be a way to kind of put the pressure on black's position. Now after Rook E4, black could also play Rook E8 potentially, and this exchange might be okay for black. But this might also be a little bit unpleasant, because now if I reroute my knight to B4 and I force black to play A5 and fix his pawn at a dark square, I might have a way in through the light squares with my king. So, let's say, how do I get to B4? Let's say I play Knight E1, and then King D7, Knight C2. All of a sudden, Knight B4 is going to be an idea. And let's just say, for argument's sake, that black allows this. This is precisely the type of position that is all of a sudden extremely, extremely dangerous for black. And the reason for this is because now my king can walk to B5, sometimes even further. Maybe it gets to B7. That would probably not happen. But once it gets to C4, B5, then I can actually create a pass pawn. So let's just say black is continuing to shuffle. Now B4 comes into play as a move. You pretty much have to take, because then otherwise you lose a pawn. I recapture with the C pawn, and then again, let's just say black continues to shuffle, or let's say King C8 is played, not continuing to shuffle. Now I play A5, and all of a sudden my knight is immobilizing black's C7 and D6 pawns, and my pawn is actually a serious runner. And even with King B7, I have King B5. I'm going to force the king to the 8th rank. And this is just not a pleasant position at all to play. I mean, white to me is going to be winning this in the long run, because the king will be sufficiently distracted by the A pawn, and my king will be able to waltz in and collect the pawns on the king side and in the center. And this is the kind of the thing that I was looking at and saying, wow, this is actually quite serious for white. So, again, it takes a lot of grinding and a lot of work to accomplish, but, very interesting plan. I thought, possible on a good day. But unfortunately, I did not see this Rook E1 to E4 to B4 maneuver, and that kind of hurt me, because Rook A2 was essentially a waiting move in many respects, trying to see what black would do. And it was a waiting move that also kind of was a little bit of prophylaxis against two of black's main themes, I thought. So one of them was the bishop on this long diagonal, kind of making it annoying for my rook on A1. And so I played Rook A2 to just get on a light square where it was not going to be bothered. And the other thing was, it was kind of prophylaxis against B5, because if you play Rook B8 and rush B5, I'll take on b5 and get an open a file for my rook. And so I thought that, that would be ill-advised. So anyways, after rook a2, black played rook b8 anyway, kind of revving up for b5. And here I realized that after a takes b5, rook takes b5, the d5 pawn is hanging as well, and if I step up with king c4, there's rook c5 check. And so, quite annoyingly, he could still play for this idea and then recapture with the rook, and it appears like a pawn is dropping. And so here I actually played the move b4 because I kind of recognized here that that I needed to control the c5 square, and so I essentially did not want a scenario where he plays rook takes b5, and then I wind up playing king c4 and he has rook c5 check. So my idea was now of b5, I could take with the a pawn and not fear that type of position. But the problem with b4 is that it actually weakens this entire diagonal, and now the bishop is actually way more of a factor than it was a move ago. So, the give and take, that kind of happened with b4 actually I think was in black's favor. Black now played the move c6, and I think this move actually is fully justified because of my b4 move, because now all of a sudden the c3 pawn is actually a target, and it wasn't before. And yeah, here I actually realized that any kind of advantage I had probably evaporated, because I can't even try to reinforce the d5 pawn with c4, because if I go c4, black could take on d5 and go rook c8, and all of a sudden rook c3 check is more than enough counterplay. And if I'm just passively defending the c3 square with a move like rook a3, all of a sudden black can be the one playing for the win, coming from behind and wreaking havoc in my position. So after c6, I played d takes c6. But now after king takes c6, I'm only temporarily dealing with the threat of rook c8. I mean, black can basically move the king away and still have that idea. So now I actually went rook e2, trying to shift my rook towards the king side and, at least entertaining a threat. I thought that in some positions, knight d4 might be annoying, because if we have a scenario where there's bishop takes d4, king takes d4, I still have a slightly better pawn structure because I don't have 3 pawn islands. And in some positions, maybe the rook might invade on the 7th rank. But after rook e2, black played king d7, and that's just a good move, defending the 7th rank and also introducing rook c8 as an idea. I now play knight d4, trying to block the diagonal of the bishop on f6, and now rook c8 came, and now I played c4 because I basically did not see any way to basically contend with black having really good counterplay with the move d5. If d5 is played, and all of a sudden my c pawn is actually backward, and the bishop on f6 and the pawn on d5 do a good job of controlling squares in the center. So I thought it would really not be a good idea to allow d5. But after c4, black played rook c7. I'm just waiting. I waited with the move rook c2, and now black played rook c8. I played rook e2. We seemed to be going towards repetition. And after rook c7, I tried to decline the repetition by playing the move rook a2. And my idea here was that maybe on a good day I can get in b5 and knight c6 and still retain some light square control. So let's say black does nothing and goes bishop b7, maybe b5, a5, and knight c6. And here maybe white would have some pressure because this knight is so annoying and it's really well anchored in the position. But after rook a2, black made the very, very timely break d5. And this move is really, really well timed and fully justified by the placement of my pieces, my rook on a2, and also the king on d7, also being able to recover that pawn with king d6. And so d5 is a really, really effective pawn sacrifice that really liquidates the only weakness black has in the position. And once those pawns come off the board, I actually do have to be careful because there are pawns on both sides of the board now, and in an open position, the bishop tends to fare better than the knight in those circumstances. So I played rook c2 now. Again, if I go c takes d5, then there's just king d6 and taking the pawn. So I went rook c2, d takes e4, rook takes e4. And after this exchange, I just wanted to make sure I didn't, mess up the position so that it was losing for me. Because again, the bishop is better than the knight in positions where there are pawns on both sides of the board and it's an open position. So black now went king d6. And the one thing that actually makes this a position that's still equal and not worse for me is really the position of my king on c4. Because if the king was less centralized, black would be better. So I'm going to make a bad move. I played the move knight c2, but let's say I played king d3. All of a sudden, after king d5, I actually would have to be really careful not to just lose this game very quickly, because my knight would have to retreat. This king would have opposition against the white king, and it really would be something I'd have to be very, very careful and alert with, because if I cede any more ground, the king would be coming to c4. So just a very, very, something to be aware of, that my active king's position is what holds this together. And after king c4, I played the move knight c2, not giving up that ground. After knight c2, black played bishop g5, just waiting. And I went knight e1, just kind of dancing with my knight, because I don't really have any great way to improve my position. And then after bishop h4, my pawn on f2 is harassed, and I played the move knight d3, because I didn't want to play a move like g3 and put more pawns on dark squares. So I went knight d3, and after bishop g5, knight e1, I actually offered a draw, which my opponent duly accepted. And the reason for that is I thought he was going to follow up with bishop h4, and I was going to repeat with knight d3, because trying to kind of break the repetition now would just be foolish in a position where I don't really have any kind of... I'm not playing from a position of strength, so it's not justified to keep the game going. So, yeah, interesting draw, I'd say. I think I did get a ever so slight advantage in this queenless endgame after black allowed my king to kind of walk towards the center by playing, when he played rook takes e2, and then I played king takes and then king d3. But I did not find the best way to press onward, and it was not easy. I mean, keep in mind, this is a position that really there was not much life in it, and I think most people would just write it off as a draw. But it's just the type of position that I tend to play pretty well. It kind of plays into my strengths, and so I was trying to kind of just see what I could do with it, and ultimately it was not enough the way I played to win. So that happens sometimes, and it's also kind of a warning to me that even though I do like to grind it out and trade the queens, I do give my opponent chances to hold the game. And if I really am a much stronger player than my opponent, if I am 150 points stronger than the person I'm playing against, an argument could be made that more pieces on the board is something that you want, because if you know how to use your pieces well or better than your opponents, you want to actually have more pieces to do that. I've tended to go differently with my chess approach, but it is what it is. I mean, in basketball, for instance, or in football, just in a lot of sports, the team that actually is more talented will want to have more possessions, because it's an opportunity on like a per possession basis to demonstrate their advantage. And I tended to not play chess that way because I'm a little bit uncomfortable with dynamics at times, but it is something that I need to think about if I want to make that push towards Grandmasters. I need to be more comfortable playing with dynamics against anyone, but especially against lower-rated players, because I should be better in all aspects of the game. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.